Hello and welcome to this edition of my Clarendon Chronicles podcast. My guest today is Liz Pemberton. Liz is a leading academic and influential voice in the fields of diversity and anti-racism in the UK, with a particular focus on early years and educational settings. She is the director of the Black Nursery Manager Limited, a training and consultancy company which focuses on anti-racist practice within early years. With 20 years experience in the education sector, Liz's roles have included secondary school teacher, public speaker, and up until 2020 nursery manager. With a master's degree and multiple awards recognizing her impactful work, she is a sought after keynote speaker who has addressed audiences around the world, including commentating at political conferences. Liz's mission is to promote inclusive practice in the early years sector, with a particular focus upon race, culture, and ethnicity being considered in this practice. Liz's accolades include being recognised in 2024 by Serendipity Institute for Black Arts and Heritage as one of 100 Black women who have made a mark, recognised by the Black Cultural Archives as one of their 2022 40 by 40 Future Leaders, and nominated as a finalist for Trainer of the Year for the 2022 Nursery World Awards. Her expertise and commitment to fostering inclusive environments make her a vital contributor to discussions on equity in education. And I am privileged that she's joining me today to talk about her work. Liz, welcome to my Clarendon Chronicles podcast. Great to see you once again, having worked with you in the non-executive arena a couple of years ago. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and how lovely to hear that introduction. It's sometimes it's quite nice to think about the things that you've done, have them read out to you, and just be quite proud. I felt quite proud listening to that, and also your brilliant tone. So
Thank you very much. I only practiced it a little bit beforehand anyway, so thank you for that, Liz. Great and fantastic of you to join me today. I know you're always really busy. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the work that you do. So can I start right there, Liz? Can you share with the audience exactly what is the work that you do, and perhaps dispel a few myths, maybe, about the work that people think you might do, as I'm wondering if there are some differences in those areas, Liz.
Absolutely. And I think it's always nice to be able to be very upfront, very open, and also just to kind of talk very explicitly about the need to have conversations about race, particularly in this current climate, and thinking about the work that I've done leading up to where I am now. So you said up until 2020, I was a nursery manager, and I had done that for 16, 17 years. And it was really interesting coming into what was the family business. My mother started her journey in the early years in the 80s and bought her first day nursery in Smethwick at that time, and then bought her second day nursery, a third nursery. So it was a family business. And I joined the business in the early 2000s officially. You know, I was always unofficially around the business, me and my sisters. And we were always kind of around the conversations pertaining to what it meant to have children under 5 in an environment where they were looked after, nurtured, educated, what that environment should feel like, who should be responsible for doing that. And of course, my mom being the big decision maker in the, you know, the role that she had as the business owner, but also the nursery manager, we learned a lot. I certainly learned a lot watching her and observing her. And I think when I started that journey as a manager, I thought really hard about what it felt like to be a child in an environment where you're away from your main caregivers, i.e. your parents, or the people that were responsible for your care. And I thought, what does it mean to be away from your family? Sometimes for really long, hours in the day, because the nursery opened at 7:30, closed at 6. The children were there at 7:29 and were leaving at 5:30 because parents had work commitments, etc., etc. And for me, I was really interested in why the people that came to work at the nursery came to work. What did they want to do? What did they want to leave the children feeling like? And also thinking about the areas in Birmingham, which is where I'm from, in case people weren't aware from my Brummie
No, not at all, Liz.
what did it mean to be in Birmingham, to grow up in Birmingham, and for the children that were there. And Birmingham was often spoken about as a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual city, the second city. But I was really interested in that as I was seeing the families that were accessing the nursery and where they were coming from in terms of their own cultural background, ethnic backgrounds, racial identities, and who was coming to the setting and for what reason. So one of the things my mom really valued was making sure it felt like home from home. But of
Mm,
course, that's very hard to do when you're dealing with a range of children from very different homes. And it was
mm,
always a very multicultural setting, that first nursery that she had in Smethwick. And so when she bought her second nursery in Edgbaston in Birmingham, that's the nursery I went on to manage. And by being there as Yvonne's daughter, as a Black woman, as somebody who was born in Birmingham of Jamaican heritage, culture was something that I really wanted to embed into the practice because it was something that I valued. It was something that the parents who chose to send their children to the nursery valued. And it was something that particularly parents who weren't necessarily having heritage that was rooted in the Caribbean or were not Black British or Black African, whatever, even for those parents, for white parents, they were really kind of interested in ensuring their children were in environments where it was mixed. So it wasn't monocultural, it wasn't monoracial.
mm,
And so that was always something that interested me as well. And it created this environment, not only for the children and the families, but for the team members, for the staff, which was always buzzing with something happening. There was some conversation going on pertaining to what do you like, what don't you like, what do you do, what don't you do, and having that rich environment where people were able to come and be themselves, talk about themselves, but also really celebrate themselves on a day-to-day basis. I
mm,
just thought what brilliant modeling that was for those children at a very early age to see. And when I was managing, I always ensured that whoever I employed felt like they could come and be themselves and
mm,
speak about themselves in terms of
mm,
their culture, their ethnicity, knowing that we were providing care for, as I said, a range of children, but predominantly Black children, but also acknowledging that it doesn't mean that it is just a Black nursery.
yeah, yeah.
Although we were colloquially known as the Black Nursery, there were white children there. There were children whose heritage was rooted in, Poland. There were children there that had come from Iran. There were a range of different people that were in that setting. So
Yeah.
I just thought for me, managing the nursery was something that brought me great pleasure, great joy. And then COVID happened.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting hearing you describe that because I know Birmingham reasonably well. My daughter went to university in Birmingham, so that particular Edgbaston area, I imagine Edgbaston is quite different to perhaps some of the other areas
Yeah.
around Birmingham as well.
Mhm,
So just to
mhm,
pick up on a couple of things you said there, I mean your focus is on early years. So Liz, why is the time particularly ripe now, socially and politically, to be
mm.
highlighting the necessity for your work in anti-racism in early years? What is it? Why is it now that's so important for you, Liz?
I think the climate has really shifted. I ended that answer, that last question on, and now, COVID
Mm,
hit. It was 2020. I started the organisation,
mm,
the Nursery Manager, concentrating on anti-racist education in the early years. The time politically and socially, we know we're coming to the end of a year where we've had race riots in the summer,
mm,
in August in the UK. We are not importing our idea about racism from the US. 2020 as a signifier around conversations pertaining to race, it was massive, but it was a situation which was largely happening in the US, and it began conversations more openly about race in
mm,
the UK. But for people who are racially minoritized, who are on the receiving end of racism, these conversations have never stopped. They've always
mm,
been happening. And I just think when we've looked at what's happened politically, particularly in terms of Conservative government appointments that we had before our newest Labour government, we've thought really carefully about how the media has crafted conversations pertaining to race, what
mm,
that's done in terms of influencing people's dialogue on the ground, what it's meant for diversity, equity, and inclusion in workplaces, anti-racist education in schools. And I always think, what about those children who are 0 to 5? Because they are
mm,
privy to conversations that are happening, energies that are being exuded in households, conversations by their parents, and things around that political energy that has been really kind of entrenched within British society has massively influenced how race has been spoken about. And more often than not, it's been quite negatively. And when we look at the
mm,
branches of racism, we're thinking about Islamophobia, we're thinking about anti Semitism, we're thinking about anti Blackness. We need to be ready to understand children are absorbing those messages too.
mm,
And if we are not equipped to have conversations or to be prepared to deal with racist incidents as early years educators, we're going to be at a loss. But I think it
yeah,
really has to be drilled home. Children are like sponges. They are
mm,
a product of their environment. We cannot assume children under 5 are not absorbing those messages as
mm.
well.
Really important point, and I really appreciate how you described it as well. And you spoke in great detail about your mother and and her first nursery, and
Mhm.
understanding all of these issues. Were there any other particular events or instances which shaped your motivation to invest time in your work?
Yeah, I think for me, I had come up through university and had studied theatre, actually, studied
Mm,
theatre and English. May not come as a surprise to anybody listening to me or anybody who's met me. I'm fairly animated. So studied theatre and was really interested in the art of communication, but also the way in which opportunities are presented to some people and not to others. And
mm,
also the idea about stereotypes, the idea about who people think you are based on who
mm,
you actually are and where those assumptions are born. And so for me, there were things that had happened in my life around my name, for instance.
mm,
So I was formerly Elizabeth Kerr before I married Mr. Pemberton.
mm,
And I remember being in a situation where I was being called for an interview for something, and the person came out and said, Elizabeth, and looked around the room. And I was the only person in the room, but the person didn't look at me. And in the first instance, I thought, oh, is this person not able to see me? Like I'm the only person here.
mm,
And then the second instance in my mind, I was like, oh, is it because they didn't expect me to be called Elizabeth? They expect my name
mm,
not to be that. And then I started thinking about the power of a name. And it led me to have a conversation or revisit a conversation with my parents about why they chose to name me Elizabeth.
mm,
And that brought up some really interesting points around assimilation, around sounding like you fit in. And I was
mhm,
interested in this fitting in thing, fitting into
mm,
what, fitting into who, and also being aware that my parents were born in what was colonial Jamaica
mm,
in the 50s. And so I thought about those messages. What was I being subliminally told about who I was based on a name? So that name calling incident was really interesting for me.
yeah,
And I thought,
great
what
to
does that
see.
mean if you have a Nigerian name? What does it
Mm,
mean if you have an Indian name? What does it mean if you have names that are quote unquote hard to pronounce?
yeah,
And what are these things rooted in? Is it ignorance? Is it laziness? And these assumptions made about people based on names, you know,
yeah,
how deeply rooted are they? What does
yeah.
that mean for children?
That's a really interesting perspective that you put on just through that one incident, which is
Mm,
why I asked the question: was the one incident that perhaps brought this even more to the forefront of your mind? And Liz, what conscious and unconscious biases, recognizing that the audience will work in organizations, not just education,
yeah.
leadership, management, just observers in the audience. What unconscious and conscious biases do you still see that perhaps, let's say people like me are not
Mhm.
immediately aware of?
I think which is really interesting is the framing of the language, first of all, Jeremy.
Mm,
So I reject the notion of unconscious bias.
mm,
I reject the notion of things not being consciously done. And as we are evolving and growing and being parts of members of society, our consciousness is raised around lots of things. I think there is something about using language which takes away accountability in the case of talking about racism, which means that we're always thinking, okay, what's the best way to phrase this so it doesn't offend this person? We don't want white people to feel uncomfortable, so we won't say the word black or we won't say the word white. And me naming my business the Black Nursery Manager, one of the things that it does, it forces white people to say black. It also allows you to deal with the thing that's in the room. It isn't an elephant. The reality is I'm racialized as black. I'm a black woman. And I think there's something about positioning bias as being unconscious, which makes things a little bit more palatable or comfortable. Because if you can say, oh, I didn't mean it or I didn't know, it almost changes the way in which you can manage and respond to that. If you can hold your hands up and just say, I made a mistake, correct me. Yeah, that's fine. I was conscious of my sexist language. I want to be better. It's not unconscious sexism. It's just sexism. It's not unconscious bias. It's just bias. There was not an unconscious element of that person coming into the room and, they called a name. I stood up. I said, I'm me. You've chosen to ignore that. That's not unconscious. That's a very conscious decision that you're making. So what I think when we're looking at bias, we're looking at how much are we engaging with people who are not like us in the workplace in terms of a range of things, not just in terms of race or ethnicity or culture, but thinking about gender, thinking about roles, ways in which even we met, Jeremy. There are more things that we have in common that, bring us together than actually separate us. But if we were to be in a space, people might be like, oh, Jeremy, Liz, Jeremy, how?
How did
And
that
I'd be
happen?
like, and I'd be like, well, why wouldn't I know Jeremy? Why would Jeremy not know me? And so there are lots of things that we have spoken about away from this podcast. The ways in which we have come together and found that commonality is about the humanity of us both. And so I think there is need for us to start addressing the language that we use to describe prejudice and racism. There's ways in which we have to grapple that, and that means facing it, or dealing with it face front. You have to grab it and acknowledge it exists, it's here.
And I really appreciate you describing that difference, or between conscious and unconscious, and whether that unconscious exists or not. I haven't heard that explained to me like that before, but it's a really, really powerful answer. And Liz, how do you see society and indeed governments, from whichever political persuasion they are, how do you see a response to this, and what is preventing further progress in this area?
Dealing with the reality of people's lived experiences. That's one of the things that's preventing us from moving forward. The reality is racism is a system. It is not just about the interpersonal. It isn't just about the name calling. Racism is a well-oiled machine. It has been created and used as a way to divide people and to oppress people and to ensure that things that are very outrageous become very normalized. And so when we're thinking about the ways in which politics plays its part in that, it minimizes the impact of racism for some groups over others. So you then get this kind of what I call the oppression Olympics. My concern is more valid than yours, when in actual fact, we have to think about the very real impact of anti-Semitism for our Jewish communities in the same way we need to think about the very real impact of Islamophobia for our Muslim communities in the UK, and where and how anti-Blackness shows up. But if the government don't have the language to use correctly and to also ensure that policies that are created are impactful, there is no point. You can write report after report after report. The government needs to be really sure about why they have to tackle racism in our society, because it is a cancer. It's very, very, very dangerous. And if it's left to fester, which we've seen the results of, the August of, this year, those race riots, it was very real for people who will be on the receiving end potentially of that violence, because it became very visceral and also scary. And that was something that happened as a result of things not being managed properly, communication being really ill managed, and people being very ill informed. And I think the government, politics, could take a serious role if they wanted to. At this point, for me, it feels like a decision not to address certain types of racism,
Mm.
but to be really, really strong in other types of racism. And we have to be really honest about that. It isn't to say none are valid or one is more than the other, but there has to be an equity in the approach that the government take.
I really, and I know you're doing your best to try and influence that, because I know you've spoken at a political
Mm,
conference recently as well. And
yeah,
from your work, Liz,
mm.
how would you recommend that organisations take what might even be first steps to address these issues, not in just education, but in other corporate settings as well? Where do we start?
I think you have to start with self. I always say in this, there's a lot of fear around the work of anti-racism
Mm,
because of the myths that exist, and it's this assumption that somebody's going to come into your organization, sit all the white people down and tell all the white people that they're really bad, and then say to
mm,
all of the black and global majority people, you're all victims. And that isn't the case.
mm,
The first step is to acknowledge that there is a lot of fear around this, and try to ask yourself, what is the fear? Why are you scared about broaching this topic? Is it because you think you're going to get it wrong and offend somebody? Is it because you've never spoken about race before? Have you ever thought about what box you tick on a form? When was the first time I asked these questions? When was the first time you knew you were white? Or when was the first
mm,
time you knew that you were South Asian?
yeah,
You knew that you were East or Southeast Asian, you knew you were black. I ask these questions, and white people often are, oh, I've never really thought about it,
yeah.
depending on their socialization and where they grew up, but more often than not, oh. And when I've asked people who are black or of the global majority, they have said, well, this incident happened. So it tends to usually be an incident, and that
Mm,
incident tends to be a racist incident when they were like, oh. And I think as time has gone on, there has been this need to want to have progress. White people are really interested in what's the progress? Are we better now? Are we getting into a place where racism is not going to exist? And I always say this work that I'm doing, it's legacy work. Nothing's going to change in my lifetime, in your lifetime, but we have to plant those seeds. So people who are kind of coming to this work now know that it's not about trying to go on this course and then by the end of that 90 minutes you're no longer
mm.
racist, we solved everything in society. It's not about looking at it like that. It's big picture stuff, but we all have to know we play our part, all of us. It's collaborative, it's collective. We've got to be very open with what scares us, and then we've got to bring that into the room, uh, as it were.
Some really important points, particularly at the start of your answer there, about what makes us think the way that we think in organize. What is frightening us almost, as
Yeah.
in terms of an action plan.
Mhm.
What still frustrates you then, and angers you, Liz, when you hear about things? What what what's up there in keeping you awake at night and think, if I had a magic wand,
Mm.
this is what I would do with it.
The assumption that, and particularly in my sector, the assumption that everybody that works in early years is kind and nice, therefore there is no
Mm,
such thing as racism. Um, and one of the things that happened around the race riots, some of your viewers may be aware, there was a childminder who has been punished for a racist tweet that she had put out. And she was married to, I think, a Tory councillor, but
mm,
she had tweeted something that was so disgusting and deeply racist, and so she was so unabashed. It was the fact that it was, she used X, she used that platform
mm,
to spout this. And I thought, this is a childminder. Things like that
mm,
keep me up at night. Like, this is somebody that people have entrusted to leave their children with. And we can't assume that all of those people are racist. We
mm,
can't assume that those people know how she feels either. But we have to understand that there are people that work in sectors and in spaces who hold these views. What keeps me up at night is the fact that I know I won't be able to change everybody's mind, but it is to accept and acknowledge this is still work that has to be done, and it's got to be ongoing. So I'm really concerned with, I guess, the the rate at which racism seems to be more commonplace or more acceptable, more socially acceptable than it ever was, or that there seems to be a resurgence of a far right rhetoric which is being described as just, that's just the way that it is. It's not
mm.
racist, it's not far right. This is the everyman speaking, but that everyman doesn't speak for me. It doesn't speak for the people that I engage with. So the normalizing of it, I guess, Jeremy, the normalizing of racism in British
Yeah.
society,
And
that
you
is.
mentioned that in particular, that in actual fact, I think what you really said there was we might even be going backwards.
Mm.
So what would you consider to be a demonstrative measure of progress? You know, how do we know whether we're making progress? How do we judge that?
Well, I think we certainly, flipping that on its head, we certainly feel and know when things are going the other direction.
Mm, mm,
And it is a feeling, isn't it? It's, something doesn't quite feel right. So
mm,
when we look at the fact that, okay, so we might not think that in our realities where we're living, people wouldn't use the N word or people wouldn't use the P word, but I'm
mm,
saying people do. That isn't a measure of racism getting better or worse. People are going to have the views that they have. I think there is something to be said around policy change and how attitudes are impacted by those policies that are entrenched within our societies, all of the structures and the systems that we use, housing, education, healthcare, things around, for instance, Black maternal health, Black women being 4 times more likely to die than their white counterparts when
mm,
we're thinking about maternal health, school exclusions, thinking about our Gypsy and Roma and traveller communities and our Black and mixed Black children in secondary schools, particularly. What is the impact for those children and exclusion rates? What does it mean when we're looking at those statistics? If we think about the change, those statistics shouldn't exist. That
mm,
just should not be happening. Once we can eradicate that, we will know, the rise in anti-Semitism, the rise in Islamophobia. Once we know people from various communities feel safe, there's something about a culture of safety,
yeah,
and not just physical safety, but psychological safety as well, Jeremy. That is something that can't always be measured, but we will be able to feel a shift. We'll be able to feel a shift because it would mean a job like mine, an organization like mine wouldn't exist.
yeah.
That I do
I,
this work is evidence there are
I think
big
that's
problems.
again another really powerful by saying, statistics are just bits of data and information. But if we didn't have that, so really, really well described, I think, Liz. So thank you for that. Liz, I know you have been, and in actual fact, are very much in demand for your views as a keynote speaker with your work.
Mm,
So what's the context of that, and when and where do we get to see you globally?
yeah. Globally. So I've been
I know
in,
you
I've been
because I know
in
you've
London.
been hopping around the globe.
Yeah, I have. I came back from maternity leave in May of this year. And in September of this year, I was in Hong Kong doing some work with the English Schools Foundation and delivering anti-racist education to those educators there in an international context and in an international school context, which looks very different to the work that I would do in
Yeah,
the UK.
yeah,
And when I'm talking in the UK and speaking, delivering keynotes, it's usually at education conferences where there are days where, academies or early years organizations, chains of nurseries have booked a day to have a conference to address one or two key things.
mm,
And equity and anti-racism is remaining quite high on the agenda. And it seems to be, I am in demand because educators want to know what is best practice. And it's not to say I'm the only person doing this work, because I absolutely am not. It's also not to say this work that I'm doing is brand new, because it isn't. There have been many anti-racist educators before me, and there are lots of anti-racist educators who work alongside me doing what they do. And I think when the keynote things come up, I'm really interested to see who the audiences are, because it
mm,
also allows me to address this issue around structural racism. What is happening if the majority of our head teachers are white? What is happening if the cohorts in these schools, in these nurseries, are predominantly mixed in terms of ethnicity and race and culture, but we still have a teaching staff, a body of teachers who are predominantly white? Something's happening here. It isn't that there aren't enough Black or global majority people who are good enough for the job to become head teachers or assistants or nursery managers or leaders. There is something wider at play, and this is where I get to address the room. And I'm very upfront, I'm very direct, and I ask people to look around and I ask them to see what's going on here, what is in common about the room. And it
mm.
forces people to confront it, Jeremy, and it is uncomfortable, but this work of anti-racism, it sits in that place of discomfort. I ask people to stay there only for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes. And yes, it might be very uncomfortable, but guess what? If you are living as a racially minoritized person in this country, that discomfort can last a lifetime. So
Mm.
you've got to think about this, what it means to be in a space where you're delivering keynotes. And when I'm in education conferences, or when I'm speaking at open days, or I am speaking to parent groups, because sometimes that happens, whether it be in a local community hall or a massive stadium. I'm doing something at Wembley actually in by the time this comes out, it will probably be it will have been a week since I'd have done it. But at Wembley for the independent, independent school sector, but Duke's Education to name them specifically. And
Mm.
Duke's Education deal with independent schools. So even thinking about intersections around class, social class,
Mm.
fee paying schools, nurseries, which are, we've talked, there's a lot of conversation about the cost of childcare. But I think when we're thinking about where children are going to be educated, class also has to sit alongside the conversation
Yeah.
pertaining to race. And so when I'm thinking about that work that I've been doing in the independent school sector, there's massive demand for my work there as well, which also tells you something.
Yeah. Amazing. I will look forward to that. I didn't know you were speaking at such a big venue as Wembley, so I really will look forward to the outcome of that. And finally, Liz, what's your intended legacy? I think maybe some of the viewers will have been quite surprised by
Mm,
some of the comments you made around this isn't going to be fixed within 10
yeah,
or 20 years. This
yeah,
is multiple generational
yeah.
progress to potentially still only resolve it then. And if we could sketch out what your LinkedIn profile and keynote speaker profile would
Mm,
say in 5 years' time, what
mm.
would you hope that you would have achieved in the next 5 years, Liz?
I think for me, more work that influences policy. The
Mm.
policy work that I've done so far has really been focused on early years curriculum guidance, statutory and non-statutory stuff.
Yeah.
I think my profile in terms of keynotes, more international work to bring that context around British racism, because it's a very specific brand of racism,
Mm.
instead of always thinking about a North American lens of racism, which is the one that I
Mm.
think people are more kind of aware of. There is something to be talked about in terms of migration stories in the UK and Britain, and what that's done uh, for generations of young people who are growing up here today in 2024. And I think there's been something significant about the legacy of me now being somebody's mother. So this work isn't just theory, it's practice, it's everything.
Yeah.
And what it means now to raise a Black son who's currently, just shy of 2 years old in modern Britain. So I
Mm.
want that work in 5 years' time to really think about ripple impact, not just in the UK, but continuing to grow globally for me and other people that do my work, and more collaborative stuff across sectors. So, not just in the early years education space, but thinking about higher education, thinking about business, thinking about, businesses that, as I said, exist outside of education. I would love to be able to build up a repertoire which sees me being in those spaces as well.
And how do we get in contact with you, Liz? Because I'm sure it's been really fascinating to hear some of these discussions, which I've been fascinated personally, and it'd be great if you could come on again at some point and talk perhaps in greater detail about two or
Sure,
three of the things which you described. So how do we get in contact with you, Liz? And again, I'm thinking organizations, not necessarily education, but including education. How do we
sure.
get in touch with you? Are you easily findable?
Easily findable. LinkedIn, Liz Pemberton. LinkedIn is my favorite platform at the moment. Actually, I'm really enjoying LinkedIn. So please get in contact with me via LinkedIn. I'm also on now Blue Sky, not on X. I have left X. I'm on Blue Sky again. The handle looks a little bit different, but Liz Pem. TBNM, the Black Nursery Manager. Also, I'm on Instagram at the Black Nursery Manager. I use Instagram because I want to make sure that I'm connecting with people who are working in nursery settings, and they tend to be within a particular age bracket. That's where some of them live, and they consume content in that way. So Instagram is at the Black Nursery Manager. But yeah, please get in contact with me on those platforms.
Fantastic. And if anybody can't find you, I'm sure they can always contact me and I'll put you straight in
Yeah.
touch. So, Liz, that's been amazing. I found that absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today in educating, I think not just me, but listeners and viewers as well, with the incredibly important work that you do. I really wanted you to have you on my podcast as one of my first guests, just to find out more about your advocacy, and I know we've only just scratched the surface, so I appreciate
Yeah.
you trying to summarize it for us. I'm equally sure that the listeners will have found it really powerful as well in the way that you've broken it down, even to one of your last comments there, different global versions of the work that you do and our perceptions. So thank you for sharing your insights with us all today. It's been my privilege, as I knew it would be, to speak with you today. Thank you so much for being my guest on the Clarendon Chronicles podcast, Liz.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
Liz, thank you again, and bye for now.